Good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting in 2018 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Can I remind members to put their mobile phones at least into a mode that don't interfere with proceedings? I'd be most grateful. The first item on our agenda this morning is to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Government Business and Constitutional Relations on the withdrawal agreement that was published last week. Mr Russell was joined by two Scottish Government officials, Ian Mitchell, who's the Deputy Director of EU Strategy and Migration Division, and Alan Johnston, who's the Deputy Director of EU Exit Readiness. I'll warmly welcome our witnesses to the meeting, and I just wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would like to make an opening statement.
No, I think given the detail that we're going to have to go into today, I'm very happy just to respond to questions. Clearly, I'll be addressing the issues that arise from the attempt to secure a deal by the Prime Minister and what follows from that.
Okay, Cabinet, I think we'll probably open up with a general discussion about the deal at a higher level, and then we'll get into specifics and bits of it, but we also need to cover areas about legislative consent, etc. If any future with EU withdrawal agreement bill contains such issues. Cabinet Secretary, yesterday, even about in my own constituency, talking about with individuals and businesses, and I was up in the northern part of my constituency around Callander, Cullen area yesterday. There's no question in my mind people are anxious, they're concerned about the situation that we're currently in, what the deal means for them, their families, their security and their jobs. Businesses certainly are telling me that they're concerned about their planning for the future, and it's beginning to hamper investment decisions because of the level of uncertainty. And I'm no doubt that stalling of investment plans is probably having a drag in the economy. And the clear message I'm getting from people certainly is they just want all this uncertainty to end. But they're not sure at this stage if the deal the Prime Minister is prosecuting cuts it in terms of removing that uncertainty. And therefore that concern remains. So, just as a very general opening in these circumstances, Cabinet Secretary, what's the Scottish Government's view?
Well, I entirely share the view of those who want this to come to an end. This has been an appalling period. It remains full of uncertainty and difficulty. I noticed today there's a published study, I just say it in passing, out today from a group of doctors in England that shows that prescribing of antidepressants rose immediately after the referendum. People feel terribly insecure, and it's getting worse. But I have to say that this would be, if you thought this was the moment at which you would feel better, this is a false dawn. This deal is not a deal that will do what those people and ourselves want, which is to provide certainty. Indeed, I will argue, I'm sure, during the course of this morning, this deal actually prolongs uncertainty. And I would find it highly surprising if, for example, a transition period arising out of this deal was concluded within the timescale being talked about by the Prime Minister. I think even the timescale now being talked about by Mr Burnett of the end of 2022 is ambitious in terms of the reality of the EU and how things will move. I think we have to understand what this deal is. This deal arises because of the red lines that the Prime Minister set and has set over a 2-and-a-bit-year period. There is a chart that illustrates this that was originally a slide from Task Force 50. It's reproduced all over the place. We reproduced it ourselves in one of the Scotland's Place in Europe papers. And that indicates that if you set red lines, then certain things will happen. And a red line that is set, for example, on no jurisdiction of the ECJ will have certain consequences. A red line that is set on leaving the single market and walking away from the four freedoms will have certain consequences. Now, the trouble with that is those consequences arising from those red lines will be very damaging indeed, and particularly to Scotland, particularly on the issue of freedom of movement, the issue of freedom of goods, capital and services, which are the four freedoms. On the ECJ issues and on other issues, there is a profound difficulty that will not be lessened by this. And the outcomes will be bad for Scotland in the short, medium and long term, and there will not be certainty. My own view and the view of the Scottish Government is that this is the moment in which we should work as hard as we can cross-party to ensure that this deal does not go through, to ensure that there is no deal, because that can be done, and then get ourselves to the stage where we will have a better set of outcomes. And that's what we are trying to do. I was in London on Monday at a JMC, deeply unsatisfactory JMC, and then talking to others, and the First Minister was doing the same yesterday. And we will continue to do so, and indeed in this Parliament, I'm very keen to have those discussions, and I will be having some of those between parties later this week.
Forgive me for saying so, but how realistic is it at this stage that a new deal can emerge?
It is very realistic indeed. There is an established procedure that we can follow. First of all, and fortunately the opposition parties at Westminster working together last week managed to secure a set of arrangements which means that the meaningful vote can be amended. It is, in my view, first of all essential to vote this deal down, but also for the House of Commons to indicate that there cannot be no deal. There is a procedure that would then allow 21 days for other proposals to be brought. The opposition parties are working with a sensible government, and it would be good to see that. The opposition parties working, hopefully, with government can devise other scenarios, and there's a range of scenarios. You could start with the sensible move of staying in the single market and the customs union as an EEA option, and that's really a sensible thing to do. But there are other options, and we're neither ruling them in or out. You could have an election, you could have a people's vote, and of course there will be discussions about other possibilities. What nobody should do is simply say it is this deal or nothing, because it isn't. Even the Prime Minister herself admitted that outside Downing Street last week, because she talked about no Brexit in those consequences, and that is also a possibility. So if we were to find ourselves in a position of accepting this deal because we wanted this ordeal to be over, we would be making a profound mistake with really damaging consequences, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us.
James Kelly.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to be clear and kind of develop a bit in terms of what you've been discussing there in relation to the implications of the vote that will take place at the House of Commons. I think it's quite clear at this point that that vote won't be successful and the deal in its current form wouldn't get through the House of Commons. So your view then is that post that, there's this 21-day period and you would seek to explore options for changing the deal, but you would also look at the options of a general election and a people's vote?
Yes, I mean, I think you might be able to come to an agreement before the meaningful vote as to what the next step would be. But the priority, and I said this on Monday, and I'll say it again now, the priority is to vote down this deal, not to allow the damage to take place. But the range of options are as you indicate, and those would include a general election, a people's vote, single market customs union membership, a range of other things. What we shouldn't be dragooned into thinking is that either we accept the deal or chaos ensues. That is not the case. We shouldn't allow that to be the case, and it doesn't have to be the case. But working across party is now absolutely essential in this regard, and I'm glad that work is underway. The First Minister met Jeremy Corbyn and some of his colleagues yesterday, met Vince Cable yesterday, met the leader of Plaid and the Greens yesterday, and those meetings will continue.
Do you think Article 50 would need to be extended, or do you think that post a deal being voted down by the House of Commons, there's still a possibility for a way forward to be worked out?
I think we should recognise that it is not about renegotiating this deal. And in that regard, the EU are firm, and they're quite right to be firm. It's taken a long time to get to this, but this deal, as I said at the outcome, is driven by the red lines. And we have to stop up that being driven by these red lines. I think the indications are also, if there is a material change, in other words, the House of Commons votes this down, then the UK government should request an extension of Article 50, which is, of course, in the text of Article 50 itself, that is a possibility. And I think if there was a material change, my view is the EU would look at that sympathetically, because they wouldn't want this to descend into complete further chaos.
Okay.
Murdo?
Thank you. Convener, I'm going to ask about the consequences of a no-deal Brexit, but before I do that, I just want to clarify something. You've been very negative about the draft withdrawal agreement. I assume that means that you've read it?
Well, I have it here. I have, you could say, skimmed it. I did note David Alan Green's tweet yesterday, which I thought was very accurate. It is probably only possible for anybody who is engaged in any other work to skim a document of this complexity, particularly if you're not a lawyer. If you are a lawyer, he said it would take you 3 days of solid study to understand it fully. I am not a lawyer and I haven't spent 3 days on it, but I am familiar with its contents. I'm also familiar with the contents of the draft political declaration as published, but I have not seen any of the developments of that, which have clearly been taking place in the last 24 to 48 hours. But it is here. If you want to ask specific questions about it, we would have to go through it and find those things. It's not electronically indexed, but it is here, and it is clearly of importance.
Okay. I appreciate you're not a lawyer, Mr. Russell, but you will have in the employment of the Scottish Government, I dare say, many well-qualified and eminent lawyers who can assist you on that. Can I ask you, therefore, when did you read the agreement?
Well, I read the agreement when it was started to read it when it first came out, and
Okay.
continued to read it over the weekend, and it is here. But I am not a lawyer, and I'm not going to debate or discuss the fine print of this. We have lawyers in this room who are more than capable of doing so, and I'm sure want to do so. You indeed are a lawyer. What I'm familiar with is both what is in here in the draft political declaration, and also I'm familiar with the recommendations and information that's come to me, as you say, from distinguished lawyers.
Okay.
And,
But you skimmed the document and you formed a view on it when it was published. I'm just wondering how you were able to do that, because the document went in the public domain at 11:46 a.m. last Wednesday, and at 12:09 p.m., 23 minutes later, you tweeted the following: "This is a very poor and disastrous deal." So much of the document had you read?
well, you see, what you're
At that
endeavouring
point.
to, what you're endeavouring to do is to say that I came to this document unwilling to accept that
Indeed.
I would accept it. And
And
indeed,
the evidence would suggest that is
well,
the case.
Well, I came to this document on the basis, as I've said, Mr. Fraser, and I think it's very clear, if you have an agreement based upon a set of red lines, which will be very damaging to Scotland, which this document is, then you cannot have an agreement that is going to be good for Scotland. Now, I have to say, had I proved to be wrong in that, I would have admitted to be wrong. I am not wrong. And neither is the opinion of all of those who have looked at it and said to themselves, this will be a disastrous deal for Scotland. And as a representative of a Scottish constituency and a member of the Scottish Parliament and a minister, my view is that this is very bad for Scotland. Okay. I would hope that all those who are responsible to their constituents in Scotland would come to the same factual conclusion.
Okay, so we established you made up your mind before you even saw the text of the document that it was a bad deal and you weren't going to like it. So we've established that. Thank you. Can I ask, therefore, we heard a lot of concern about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. We've heard that from a whole range of industry sectors and a whole range of those, indeed, across the public sector and indeed the public about a no-deal. Is this better than a no-deal or worse?
It is, a no-deal would be worse than this.
Right. Okay. So when it comes to a choice between this and a no-deal, this is better.
When it comes to
and
choice...
You will support
well,
it?
no, when it comes to choice between this or alien invasion, this is better. But the reality of the situation is both are very bad. We could go into semantics and discuss what that means in terms of comparatives.
With respect, alien invasion is
but
somewhat less likely than a no-deal Brexit.
Oh, I don't know. Have you seen Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Really? Oh, yeah, okay. Let me make one more question. Let's try and elevate this discussion if we can, Cabinet Secretary, okay, and not get personal about it. Sorry, Convener?
On we go.
Sorry?
Please continue.
Okay. We've heard in the last few days calls from the Confederation of British Industry, calls from the National Farmers Unions across the United Kingdom, including in Scotland, urging support for the Prime Minister's deal. Shouldn't you be listening to them?
I am not only listening to them, Mr. Fraser, I'm engaging with them. And I'm engaging with them on the basis that I've indicated to you that I fully understand the position that they're taking. They have been treated abominably by the current Conservative government for the last 2.5 years. They quite clearly want the agony to end, and I fully understand that. But I also think that a measured approach to this, I would say two things. One is this is very bad and will continue to create uncertainty and damage in the long term, and therefore it's important that that is recognised. And secondly, I want to counter the false propaganda that it is only this deal or no deal. That is not true. And therefore it is an obligation upon me to say it isn't true, and therefore to talk about what can be done. And that's precisely what I'm doing, and I'm going to go on doing.
Okay, thank you.
Tom, you got a quick supplementary.
Very frankly, Good morning. I just wonder, Mr Russell, if, like myself, you took the liberty of reading the draft withdrawal agreement as published on the 19th of March, therefore vitiating the need to go and read through the entire withdrawal agreement as published last week, allowing you to focus on the key matters which weren't published in March.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and this doesn't come as an enormous surprise. You know, I would have hoped that the Prime Minister could have done better, but I just go back to this really important point. That what is in this arises out of the red lines. And, you know, the Barnier slide is of great importance in this. And we saw that slide, 18 months ago, certainly a year ago. And what the slide tells you is, if you set these red lines, this is what's going to happen. These are the outcomes. Now, the Prime Minister set these red lines in an attempt to balance the forces in her warring party. Those red lines have resulted in this bad situation. It's not a surprise. You know, nobody came to this tabula rasa. They came to it knowing what had taken place.
Thank you.
Patrick, you had to get, in the generality, I know you've got other questions about the GM, the committee process, but you want to talk about the generality at this stage?
Well, I think the questions I wanted to ask about the Joint Committee are relevant to the discussions about initial reactions that just came up. You're right, Cabinet Secretary, there's no electronic index. It's not a very well presented document in terms of making it easy to understand. But it did take me about 5 minutes with the Control F function on my computer just to find that there is no mechanism included for the clear input of either the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, or other devolved administrations. The joint committee that's set up under Article 164 between the UK and the EU, which will be really pretty crucial in trying to smooth out any conflicts that arise if this agreement is actually put in place, so all on the assumption that it's been passed by Westminster and put into law. That joint committee, has there been any discussion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government about how that's supposed to operate and the means by which there'd be input? Because in the absence of Scottish MEPs, it seems to me this is the only route in to the discussions about how to implement and how to continue to negotiate either the transition period or the longer term future.
There has been no such discussion, but the precedent in this is worrying. There was a discussion at GMC, I think last week, led by Suella Braverman, yet another one who isn't there now, and led well, I have to say. I thought she was an effective minister in terms of taking her brief forward. About the Independent Monitoring Authority on the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. And both Mark Drakeford in Wales and myself made the point that we expected to see, and thought we had to see, a representative of Scotland on that. What we were getting back was what often you get back in these discussions. This isn't going to be representational. This is going to be based on merit. And I did make the point that I thought there would be at least one person who was meritorious enough in Scotland and one person meritorious enough in Wales to serve upon it. Exactly the same, of course, with the Trade Remedy Authority. No membership, despite the fact that this was pursued in the House of Commons. So, in my view, the Joint Committee will not presumably contain that balance which it should contain. Now, I'd want to see that if this were to come to pass. I would want to make sure that Scotland was in there, but the precedent isn't good.
There is a provision that says that this joint committee will make its decisions by mutual agreement. It seems to me either there's an opportunity to ensure that the UK on this joint committee is represented by all ministers who have an interest in matters under discussion. So if there's a devolved matter, the devolved administrations would be physically present on that committee. Or that the positions of the UK on that committee are those reached by mutual agreement in the UK's internal JMC mechanism. Yeah. Do you have a view about what would be the best way of doing this? I mean, I'd personally be happy to see this deal struck down, but it is theoretically possible that it will be implemented and we'll be living with these provisions. Yeah. How should it work? And what efforts are you making to change the thinking of the UK about how it's going to work.
Can I roll that question back just a step? Whatever arrangements are come to, we'll need to recognise both the existence of devolution and the fact that devolution is badly broken as a result of Brexit. So this is tied up with the issue of what happens next in terms of the involvement of the devolved administrations. It would seem to me that the poor understanding of devolution exists in the UK government at the present moment, fails to understand that there's no hierarchy of governments. There's a hierarchy of parliaments, there's no hierarchy of governments. So there are responsibilities for each government. Now, that's not to say that the UK government can't overrule the Scottish government, of course it can, but by using the parliamentary route. It is that hierarchy of parliaments. So it would seem to me that the important thing is to recognise the need to ensure that where there is a devolved responsibility, then the minister with that responsibility is the one involved in this process. And that leads you to the assumption that some sort of mechanism, such as the Carwyn Jones has talked about frequently, of having some sort of council of ministers of these islands that sit as equals, dealing with issues which, for example, the UK government will deal with for England, Welsh ministers will deal with, Scottish ministers will deal with, and when they exist, Northern Ireland ministers would deal with, would be the right way forward. That would mean that in your, what you're postulating, the involvement of those ministers as equals within that process would be the right thing to do. Now, that, deciding upon that, should be part of the process of looking at the failures of devolution to cope with the present situation and changing it accordingly.
Thank you.
Now, you yourself just raised Cabinet Secretary issues of involvement of devolved institutions, and I think we should go there now around issues of consent. Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Before I ask you questions of consent, Cabinet Secretary, I'm not sure I have your attention yet.
Sorry, yes. Sorry.
Are you ready?
I am, of course, ready.
Before I go into questions of consent, Cabinet Secretary, the presiding officer of this Parliament has many times reminded us all that in these debates we should treat other parliamentarians in parliaments across this country with dignity and respect. And I have my quarrels with Jacob Rees-Mogg too, but describing him in the context of an alien invasion is a remark which I know it was a rush of blood to the head, Cabinet Secretary, but frankly was beneath you. Would you like to withdraw it?
No, my blood didn't rush to my head, but if the joke misfired in any sense, then of course I'm sorry about that.
Thank you for that, and I'm sure Mr. Rees-Mogg will appreciate the apology. Certainly I do. A legislative consent, Cabinet Secretary, is it still the Scottish Government's position that the Scottish Government will not participate in any legislative consent process with regard to any Brexit legislation?
Yes.
So this presumably includes any future legislation about with regard to the withdrawal agreement?
It does.
Thank you. Does it also extend to the legislative consent process which is underway with regard to the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill?
It may not extend to that. That is a matter that we have to fully discuss with the relevant ministers.
Who's the relevant minister?
It would be Jean Freeman, I would think.
Okay. But the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill is Brexit legislation.
Yes,
Brexit-related legislation, is it not?
It is, and I don't want to give a hard and fast answer on the Healthcare Arrangements Bill because it does cover a significant number of individuals who will require services. And in those circumstances, I don't want to give that at this present moment because I want to discuss it with the relevant minister.
Okay, so as I understand it, Cabinet Secretary, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill gives the Secretary of State powers to fund and arrange healthcare for British citizens living in the EU27 after we leave the European Union. And among other matters, it will help nearly 200,000 British pensioners, including Scottish pensioners, of course, living in EU countries, to continue to access the healthcare that they need, and it will mean that hundreds of thousands of British citizens, including people who live and work in Scotland, who require medical treatment each year during holidays in Europe, can still be covered for medical assistance when they need it. And this is, as we have agreed, Brexit-related legislation, and is therefore legislation that you have said, and you just reconfirmed, that you wish to have no part of the legislative consent process with regard to any Brexit-related legislation. Now, as I understand it, Cabinet Secretary, Scottish pensioners living abroad would continue to have their health care paid because the UK government would legislate for that anyway, even if your consent, or indeed Holyrood's consent, is not forthcoming. But there are categories of people that the bill cannot cover in Scotland unless there is a legislative consent memorandum and indeed a legislative consent motion passed. so that, for example, present arrangements that enable patients in the United Kingdom to be treated by the NHS, being treated by the NHS to travel to an EU country for treatment if required, would no longer be possible for NHS patients in Scotland. Is it really the Scottish Government's view that the devolution process is so broken because of Brexit that these patients should be harmed in this way?
Well, let me repeat the answer I gave to you before you asked that question. I will have discussions with the relevant minister because I recognise the sensitivity of this, and that is our position. So if you are arguing I'm taking a hard and fast view on that bill, I am not.
So it's no longer the case that the Scottish Government will not participate in the legislative consent process for all Brexit-related legislation?
Perhaps I could just say, would you rather I had a hard and fast view that did what you wanted me to do clearly, which is to deprive people of the services, or would you rather that I took a pragmatic, sensitive and sensible view, which is what I am taking?
I would rather that you were accurate in your answers to questions that are asked in good faith by this committee. And the question is it the Scottish Government's position that the Scottish Government will have nothing to do with the legislative consent process with regard to any Brexit-related legislation?
It is the Scottish Government's position that I will consider on their merits, as the Cabinet will, issues that arise, including issues that are of great sensitivity. That is what you would expect a government to do.
So having thrown all your toys out the pram, you're now having to get them back in the pram, aren't you?
Convener, I think there was a question about respect at the start of this. That seems to have disappeared.
Well, look, I understand this is an emotional matter, and I just ask everyone involved in these discussions from it to try to recognise we're trying to do a job as best as we can in as civil a way as we can, regardless who we are around this table. I think that would be helpful. I think that takes us to... Well, actually, let me ask a question, first of all, about legislative consent issues, because if the withdrawal agreement is voted on by the UK Parliament, that will require domestic legislation in the UK. And has there been any discussions with the United Kingdom government about the areas of the bill which may require legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament?
Yes, there have been, in terms of the withdrawal implementation bill. I said earlier, and I want to say it again, Suella Braverman, who was handling this for the UK government through JMC, was doing extremely well. And was doing it in a very positive and constructive way. And both Mark Drakeford and I indicated at the meeting on Tuesday, on Monday, we will miss her because she was consulting, she was bringing material to us. That doesn't alter the fact that we do not believe that we should give legislative consent, given that the legislative consent process is broken and was clearly broken in the way the UK government behaved earlier this year. But there are areas in the bill that will require legislative consent. We have negotiated and discussed details of the bill and will continue to do so. We could resolve the issue of legislative consent very quickly. I have put proposals, as people on this table know, to David Liddington, which would resolve this instantly. And I had another conversation with him about them last week. Regrettably, the UK government have not brought those forward and have not agreed them. When they agree them, if they agree them, then we can move into a situation which will allow us to operate in as constructive a way as possible by having profound disagreements about what the issues are. Profound disagreements, I have to say, undertaken in a civilised and sometimes jocular way, as it should be.
Okay, we move into some of the specifics now. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Cabinet Secretary, good morning, everybody. I'm interested in issues around fishing and the Common Fisheries Policy as we move forward. There's been some interesting info in our briefing that the draft withdrawal agreement contains provisions related to fisheries with transition, future relationship and the potential use of the backstop. And I'm aware that concerns have been raised about the issue of backstop and access to waters and access to markets. And I don't know if I fully understand it. I wondered if you could tell me, how do we plan to have access to our waters with the Scottish fishermen as we move forward?
Well, I think this agreement indicates that that's not likely to happen in the way that the Scottish fishermen have been promised, repeatedly promised by the Conservative Party at every level, that it would happen. This won't be a surprise to observers of this over the last 40 to 45 years, because the story of the last 40 to 45 years is a constant disappointment from the UK government, UK governments to Scottish fishermen in terms of what they've been promised and what is actually delivered. This deal indicates that there could be at some stage the status of a coastal state. What it also indicates is that there are already discussions underway about trading off access for other issues. It also does so with one new element, which is very concerning. Suddenly, out of nowhere, aquaculture appears in this matter. Aquaculture is actually worth more to the Scottish economy than the other parts of the fishing industry. It appears to have been thrown in here as something to be traded off. I heard at the weekend from somebody I know who's a senior journalist in Norway, who says that the Norwegian aquaculture industry are thrilled by this because they think it will diminish the competitiveness of the Scottish aquaculture industry. So I think we're seeing something very cynical in this, cynical in terms of promises to the Scottish fishermen, and cynical and damaging in terms of the aquaculture industry. And the final point I would give to you on this is if transition is longer than presently stated, and it will be. I mean, there is a European election in June next year. It will be October at least, and possibly the end of the year before a new commission is in place. That will leave a single year for the complex negotiations, which are far more complex than what has happened up until now. So let us assume that transition will take considerably longer. That means we could be at 2022, 2023, before there's any resolution of this, again, contrary to the promises that have been made. So I think we should be very straight about this. The Prime Minister's so-called deal in here doesn't even honour the commitments to the one sector, I have to say, that she talks about in the Scottish economy. She never talks about any other sector in the Scottish economy, but she talks about fishing because she thinks she's got support there. That support might be eroding faster than she expects, given the nature of this deal.
Just a quick sup. Secretary of State David Mundell said he was content with the fishing deal, and he used that one word, content. But I mean, I would be more inclined to use the words continued uncertainty or you know, potential sellout again. Is that something that we should be like alerting the fishermen about?
Well, if fishing was a red line for the Secretary of State for Scotland and the status of Northern Ireland, then I don't really quite understand why he hasn't recognised that, but that's a matter for him.
Okay, thank you.
Alex, you've got questions on agriculture.
Thank you, Convener, and can I note my register of interest around agriculture. Cabinet Secretary, you say everyone shared your immediate rejection of withdrawal agreement, but NFU Scotland in a joint statement said that whilst the draft BrExit withdrawal agreement, whilst not perfect, was an opportunity that needs to be taken. Were they wrong?
I didn't say that everyone immediately rejected the draft withdrawal agreement. What I said was that I believe that I have the greatest understanding and sympathy for those who want to get this agony over, an agony imposed by the Conservatives. But I do think it will turn out to be a disappointment to them, a point I have already made to the NFU and will continue to make to them on the basis of the analysis that I have given you and further information. We will publish more information over the next few days that will indicate what the real problems are within this.
Thank you. Angela?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Good morning to the panel. Before I ask some questions around EU citizens and migration, the Cabinet Secretary knows me well, and he knows that I just like to cut to the chase. And it seems to me, and I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that England and Wales get what they've voted for. Remain voting Northern Ireland is getting a special arrangement to stay close to the EU. And rightly so, and for good reasons. Yet Scotland, with the highest vote to remain in the UK, has, in my view, been ignored. And that leads me to ask the question, in less than the 23 minutes referred to by Mr Fraser. How come everybody else gets what they voted for? And given that they say that past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour, and we know that the LCM process has been trashed, we have heard countless accounts how the joint ministerial committees have been frustrating. There's no membership for Scotland on the joint committees. How confident are you that the UK government is going to start treating this Parliament and the people of Scotland with the dignity, fairness and respect that they demand and deserve?
I am very familiar with your direct approach. I'll give you a direct answer. I have no such confidence at all. I think, as you say, and you're well qualified as a former professional and social worker in this to say past behaviour is often an indicator. I see no change coming at all. I would only add one thing. It's not just all those areas that have got what they asked for. Gibraltar, of course, got what they expected, and I'm very glad about that. I rejoice that Gibraltar and Northern Ireland have got arrangements which suit them. I understand, of course, in Wales, for example, the vote was very likely now against leaving, but they did originally vote by a small majority to leave. Scotland has been uniquely disadvantaged and remains uniquely disadvantaged. Now, you would think, given that the governing party at Westminster has 13 Scottish MPs, they would be leaping up and down and demanding a better treatment for Scotland. The opposite is the case. They're actually demanding that Scotland is treated as badly as everybody else. I do think that's a bit weird.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary has seen the BBC reports of Mrs May's remarks yesterday to the CBI, where she has vowed to put a stop to EU nationals jumping the queue. She didn't, of course, set out any details how she proposes to do that. So it would again seem to me that the Tories are once again appealing to the lowest common denominator, a theme through this whole Brexit debate that has its roots back to the referendum. But I wondered, what is your reaction, given that there is a positive case, an economic case for migration and the importance of freedom of movement, and the facts that we know the EU nationals are also net contributors?
It was a substantive item of discussion at the JMC. In fact, has been several times migration, but on Monday there was a very, very strong view put both by myself and Mark Drakeford that we found this totally unacceptable. And indeed, I went so far in the television interviews afterwards to say that I specifically disassociated the Scottish Government from those remarks. They are disgraceful. They are, in my view, dog whistle politics. They are designed to play to the lowest common denominator, and they're also wrong. They're wrong, both morally wrong, but they're wrong in the practicalities of the situation. Migration is a benefit to Scotland. As you say, it's a net benefit in terms of the earning potential and contribution of migrants. But they're an essential in terms of Scotland and Scotland's economic health. I mean, I say again and again that in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, 20% of the working age population will retire within the next 5 to 10 years. The people are not reproducing themselves. There's no growth in the Highland population unless it comes from migration. If you do what is proposed, actually this Prime Minister's deal proposes, then you will condemn the Highlands of Islands of Scotland to perpetual long-term labour shortages in key sectors. I met with the lead tourism provider in my constituency some weeks ago, who told me that on the sites that they manage, they have been between 10 and 15% down in workforce for the last year. That they are now paying cleaning staff up to £12 an hour because they have to compete because there's a real shortage of staff. And that is kicking in progressively every year. And it's not just in tourism, it's every part of the labour force. This is self-defeating. But the language of it is wrong too. The language is driving people away. And it's utterly the wrong thing to do. And we will have nothing to do with it. And nobody in this country should have anything to do with it because it's against our own interests to argue in this way.
Okay. And I'm sure Mr Russell is also aware that this committee has acknowledged and indeed opined on the financial risks associated to our budget with the demographic challenge facing Scotland. We know that over the next 25 years, the pensioner age population will increase by 25%, and yet there's a predicted contraction in the working age population. We know that Scotland, in comparison to the rest of UK, that the impact of migration on our GDP is, potentially greater. So I wondered, what certainty does the proposed withdrawal agreement give to Scotland that, our particular needs are going to be met?
We gave very comprehensive evidence to the MAC study. We were immensely disappointed with it. So were Wales, so were Northern Ireland. There was a complete inability to understand the economies of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. It was incredibly Anglo-centric. And this has continued because the UK government is leaning upon this false analysis in order to drive forward a policy that will do huge damage. I mean, I have to say I really laboured the point on Monday in London. They have to recognise, the UK government has to recognise, this is not, as one of the previous immigration ministers said, oh, well, the same sort of difficulty as we have in a shortage of construction workers. This is existential for Scotland. If the population declines in the way that it looks it may decline, in the scenario of zero EU migration, the population would decline by 3% by 2041. In those circumstances, that will be particularly concentrated in rural areas and particularly in the west of Scotland. So I speak with some passion about this because of my own constituency. That type of depopulation drives down the availability of services, is circular. You have it feeds upon itself, and it leads to whole communities essentially declining, dying, and being emptied. And that's the reality. And that's what Scotland is being condemned to by a government in London that is not listening. And that's why I feel particularly strongly about it, because I really want to take those people. I want to take Caroline Lucas, the immigration minister, to the islands of Argyll and point out to her the consequences of the actions which she appears to wish to take will lead to the decline and actually emptying of those communities. And that's the reality. And that's what they need to know. And surely in those circumstances, if they saw it with their own eyes, they would desist from their destructive actions.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Neil.
Convener, good morning. Cabinet Secretary, I want to ask you about the effect the withdrawal agreement will have on ongoing discussions about common UK frameworks. Do you accept there is now a greater urgency in agreeing those frameworks in the possible event of a hard Brexit? And what impact will the Northern Ireland Protocol within the withdrawal agreement have on the negotiation of common UK frameworks and the operation of the UK internal market?
Two related questions. On frameworks, we have tried very hard over the last 2 years of the JMC, and astonishingly the 15th meeting was held this week. We have tried very hard to see if we could get a modus operandi through the frameworks that at least allowed some activity and work together to take place. And we've been quite successful, I have to say, because of a determination by those of us to do so and because of superb work by officials. So I'm not intending to threaten the work of the frameworks in any way. We are continuing to make progress. There's a lot of stuff in there and operating. I said, I think, at a previous meeting of this committee, the real problem with frameworks, I think I actually said it at the event that the committee held in the RSE, is the more you have to write them down, the less easy it is to get agreement. If they operate on the basis of mutual cooperation, if they operate on the basis of established relationships, they can tend to work quite well. When you get to something like the agriculture bill, when you're trying to make it very specific, you do have a problem because there will clearly be issues of difficulty in agreement. But even then, discussion, even in that instance, discussion is continuing. So I hope we can continue work on frameworks, though the relationship is poor, and I have to say that there's a complete lack of trust, I think, on both sides. And we are also in a situation where we profoundly disagree with what is now taking place. In terms of the Northern Irish situation, the conundrum of that presents an additional issue to frameworks. And the conundrum is this. If you are trying to engage the 4 countries of these islands to work together in a framework, but one of those is in actual fact in regulatory alignment with an EU country, which will be the case, in terms of the Northern Ireland situation, then there are difficulties in managing that. We pointed that out at the very beginning. It has not been addressed by the UK. I think we will begin to see it. Now, of course, if there was another one, if we were also in that situation, then the benefits might accrue to the other members who weren't. But at the present moment, it's not clear how that will happen with simply one of us and operating in a different way and perhaps in a different market. Finally, there is nothing that prevents, as far as we understand it, within the agreement that would prevent Northern Ireland fully accessing the UK market. Contrary to what I noticed Sammy Wilson was saying the other day, there isn't anything that would prevent that. So in those circumstances, the operation of the so-called UK internal market would presumably continue. The UK internal market must be predicated upon the understanding of devolution and the legal reality of devolution that exists. And some of the way in which the UK internal market is being talked about seems to ignore the reality of devolution and subsidiarity. And we will resist any changes that push us in that direction. Thanks.
Willie, I have questions in this area as well.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Cabinet Secretary, the Secretary of State last month said that he couldn't support a differentiated deal for Northern Ireland. Now we've got one now, he appears to support it. Could you give us your view about what the difficulties that Scottish producers will face if this deal goes ahead in this manner?
Well, they are legion. If you have, a very close neighbour here who essentially which can access the single market in a way that we can't, you will, on the very crudest level, be competing with one hand tied behind your back. If you are an incoming investor and you want to access the single market, you'll base yourself in Northern Ireland, not in Scotland. You will be able to have preferential treatment in terms of your goods and how they move, including services, of course, which will not be available to Scotland. So it will be an additional element of competition, which will be difficult to deal with. It will also mean that those who manufacture in Northern Ireland, whether it be food, drink, agri-food is very important to Northern Ireland, a range of other things, will be operating with full European standards in perpetuity, because that's what the backstop is about. Whereas, we will be at the mercy of a UK government which may be increasingly driven towards coming to trade deals with people whose standards are not the same standards as the European standards. And in those circumstances, that will also lead to a deterioration of our ability to compete effectively in the markets we should be competing in. So it's a wrong thing to happen. Now, this is driven by a UK government that doesn't want to give anything to Scotland. I mean, that's actually the centre of their thinking. We saw the reports that in their discussions on the Northern Ireland backstop in Brussels, they were desperate to ensure that any drafting excluded any possibility of Scotland being involved. There is a dog-in-the-manger attitude towards Scotland, which simply cannot be overcome as far as I can see it. So in those circumstances, this exclusion will be damaging, and they know it will be damaging. So why the Secretary of State for Scotland doesn't see it be damaging, I have no idea. Maybe he's reading a different document.
I mean, as we move forward from this, and if this deal is rejected by the House of Commons, how do we move forward from that to try to get at least the same kind of arrangement for Northern Ireland, for Scotland too, in some future discussion beyond this deal being trashed, basically?
We very much recognise what Northern Ireland needs, and we have no difficulty with that at all. We support it very strongly. We're not resisting it in any way. Indeed, were Scotland to be offered what Northern Ireland is offered, I wouldn't be sitting here criticising the withdrawal agreement. I would say I still want to stay in the EU because I do want to stay in the EU. But, that deal would be a deal which we could certainly negotiate seriously upon. Far back, Scotland's Place in Europe, which we published in December 2016, we indicated why single market membership was of vital importance to Scotland. We indicated that we would prefer the whole of the UK to stay in the single market, but if that didn't happen, then we would want to see Scotland staying in the single market, a differentiated deal. David Davis told me to my face in his office in the House of Commons in January 2017 that was, in his words, impossible. It could not be done. Right? Now we see it not only could be done, but is going to be done. So, that is particularly galling. Scotland's Place in Europe also indicated that to make it really effective, then you would move on and strengthen the devolution package. It gives, for example, legal personality to Scotland. It allowed Scotland to take part, as the subsidiary parliaments do in Belgium, in trade discussions and negotiations. So you get a strong package out of it. Scotland's had nothing out of it.
Is there any support for Scotland's position, do you think, in the House of Commons opposition parties on this issue about?
Well, I think you'd have to ask the House of Commons opposition parties. I noticed that Jeremy Corbyn referred on, I think last week, in response to the Prime Minister in her statement, talked about the issue of the migration and devolution, and I think that was an important contribution that he made. So clearly there's an understanding. Now, may not be and probably isn't exactly the same as I'm expressing it, but I think there is an understanding that these are live issues. And basic Democrats would look at this and say, hang on a minute. I mean, and the point that Angela Constance made, if Scotland voted 62% to remain, surely in a mature political system there would have been a sensible negotiation that would have recognised that and allowed for that within the overall polity that the UK government was pursuing. There has been no recognition of it at all.
Okay.
We want to ask stuff about digital, perhaps, Willie. We'll come back to that, though, because I've still got other supplementaries in this area. Patrick?
Thanks very much. I just wanted to come back on the issues relating to the arrangements in the withdrawal agreement for Northern Ireland, or to prevent a hard border, and the relationship to the later discussion on frameworks, because we talk about frameworks almost in a sort of technocratic sense, that it's a merely operational or administrative arrangement to allow separate policy to exist and some shared decisions to bind them together. If frameworks are this technocratic arrangement, they should be ideologically neutral. It seems to me that the level playing field commitments in the Northern Ireland backstop place a great deal of emphasis on things that restrict the ability of governments to make decisions, like state aid, and very little emphasis on things that restrict the operation of the private sector, like environmental regulations or workplace protections. So it seems to me that this is an ideologically loaded framework, if you like. Is there a danger, not only that has an impact on Northern Ireland, but that is the tone of the discussion on common frameworks in future, that we don't see something which merely facilitates good government, but something which is ideologically loaded in favour of the kind of politics that some on the hard right of the Conservative Party, whatever their planetary origin, would like to see imposed on us.
I'm not going to rise to that one particularly, but I have to say that the hard right, of course, is driving this debate, and Brexit is a hard right policy. And the rest of the Conservative Party, even in Scotland, have simply gone along with it, presumably for fear of the Conservatives not being in office. I think the point you raise is an important one. My position has been, and I think it's been the position of others who've been negotiating this, to see frameworks as a scaffolding, around the building, and to make sure the scaffolding's there and can be used. The actual agreements lie within the building itself, within each of the subjects that we're dealing with. And of course, on those, the policy differences become important. If there is freedom to operate in those key policy areas, that's fine. But in some reserved areas, there will be no such freedom to operate. And in those areas, then the type of push you're talking about is taking place. That is why it is very important that this Parliament is the master of all the issues rather than merely some of them, so that we don't find ourselves in that position.
Thank you.
No, Adam.
I wanted to ask a slightly different question, but I wanted to ask a supplementary to Willie Coffey's question, but I now have a supplementary to Patrick Harvie's supplementary to Willie Coffey's question, which the Convener and I were just talking about as you were answering it, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, it is the case, isn't it, that there are included within Annex 5, which is the very long list of single market provisions that will continue to apply in Northern Ireland, but not in the rest of the United Kingdom in the event that the protocol comes into force. Included within that list are quite a number of environmental regulations and directives. So it's not the case that as Mr. Harvie may have implied, that all of the single market rules and regulations which will apply in Northern Ireland are restrictions on government. Some of them are quite a lot of them actually are about product standardisation, product safety, environmental standards, and so on and so forth.
They won't apply in Scotland.
No, but the argument that Mr. Harvie was, well, the question which Mr. Harvie put to you was about whether the construction of the single market protections which we have in the Northern Ireland Protocol in backstop is ideologically driven in favour of a particular pro-business direction. I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that would be an accurate reflection of the complexity of what's in Annex 5.
I think might be. I mean, let's not fall out about this because this is an interpretation of a question. But it seems to me that the ideological drive, insofar as it affects Scotland, will be and could be profound.
Okay. All right. I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, but very closely related to the issue that you were exploring with Mr. Coffey, and that is this. What is one of the things which is remarkable about the backstop, as it's informally called? I prefer to call it the protocol because I have the misfortune of being a lawyer and I've read this document. One of the things which is remarkable about the protocol is that the European Union has accepted something which at the beginning of this process it said it wouldn't accept, which is the disaggregation of the 4 fundamental freedoms of the single market. And what Article 6.2 of the protocol would maintain for Northern Ireland in the event that the protocol comes into force, are a series of single market provisions, a long series of single market provisions with regard to goods, not with regard to free movement of workers or people, not with regard to free movement of services, not with regard to free movement of capital, but with regard to free movement of goods. And the European Union has accepted this because, as I hope we all agree, it is imperative that Brexit does not jeopardise North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland, that Brexit does not trigger a hard border on the island of Ireland, and that Brexit does not undermine in any way any aspect of the Belfast Agreement of 1998. And I think on all of that, I think there is agreement between all of us. Certainly, Mr. Russell, there's agreement between you and me. Now, the Scottish Government want those provisions that apply with regard to Northern Ireland also to apply to Scotland, so that, in the words of the First Minister last week, there is no competitive disadvantage to businesses in Scotland. So my question is this. What evidence do you have that the European Union would be prepared to accept that these extraordinary provisions, which apply in these extraordinary circumstances because of the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, could be extended also to other parts of the United Kingdom, whether Scotland or whether the whole of the United Kingdom, given that they do fly in the face of what was one of the European Union's red lines at the beginning of the process, namely that the 4 fundamental freedoms of the single market could not be disaggregated. So, in other words, would the European Union accept that the extraordinary provisions of Article 6.2 of the Northern Ireland Protocol could be extended to other parts of the United Kingdom?
It's a good question. I think response to it should be in 2 parts, if you don't mind. The first part is to consider the whole of the UK, and the second part is to consider Scotland. Okay. In terms of the whole of the UK, I concur with your view that that particular disaggregation would be unlikely, to say the least, because it does impinge upon the integrity of the single market. So if the UK had suggested, as we don't know whether it did or not, that this was the solution that applied to the whole of the UK, that would not have been acceptable, because, as I say, the integrity of the single market would be affected. What we don't know, and I wish I did know, was at what stage, if any, in the negotiations, the UK said, I don't think it ever did, but if it did say, look, there are separate issues here in Scotland too, to which we require a particular approach. What read across could we have, given the democratic imperative to have a compromise? We don't know whether they ever said that, but we do know that all the discussions that have taken place and been reported publicly in terms of attitude towards Scotland, particularly at the start of this process, and commented upon by UK government ministers, were that if the UK were to come to the table seeking special dispensations for Scotland or particular deals for Scotland, that would have become part of the negotiation, because it would have been brought to the table by the UK. Now, I can't say whether or not that particular formulation that came out at the end would have been the same formulation that exactly applied to Northern Ireland. What I can say is that no attempt appears to have been made to do the read across by the UK government and to recognise that the case, which is a different case, of course it's a different case, but the case for ensuring that Scotland had a better treatment because, A, of how it voted, and secondly, because of the implications of competition from Northern Ireland, that was the case. Now, if the UK government were to have said, because it's late in the day for this deal, were to have said that's what should have happened, certainly my view from what I have heard in the EU is that discussion would have taken place because it would have been part of the negotiations. If it had been pursued with vigour by the UK government, in the same way as they were absolutely insistent that there had to be a deal for Northern Ireland, then I'm sure there would have been some different treatment.
Okay.
The reality was nothing was done.
Okay. So
that's where we are.
So just to be clear about this, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I do think that it's very important that we clarify this for the record. My question was, what evidence do you have that the solution proposed by the First Minister, for completely understandable reasons given everything that you've written in your various Scotland's place in Europe documents, that the solution, what evidence do you have that the solution proposed by the First Minister would be acceptable to the European Union? And your answer is you don't have any evidence that it would be acceptable to the European Union.
I know you're not trying to put words in my mouth, so I want to be absolutely clear what I say. There is no evidence that at any stage the UK endeavoured to get a differentiated deal for Scotland. Therefore, where we find ourselves is a differentiated deal for Northern Ireland, but an expression that such a deal was impossible for Scotland. That is not the case. A differentiated deal would have been possible for Scotland. What we are now left with, where there is one differentiated deal, is to say if there's only one differentiated deal on the table, we should have had it too.
But do you not accept that the European Union have accepted that there needs to be a differentiated deal for Northern Ireland to the extent that it compromises the integrity of the four fundamental freedoms, only because of what the protocol describes as the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, which are not shared by any part of Great Britain?
But we could have, and the UK government could have, and I'm not trying to be difficult about this, the UK government could have said at any stage, here are the unique circumstances in Northern Ireland and the unique circumstances in Scotland, which are not the same, absolutely not the same, but they both require, for us, speaking as the UK government, to have an understanding of that in the negotiations and to produce an outcome that is acceptable. That did not happen. So when you're at the end of that process and you have on the table one unique deal, it is entirely legitimate to say we should have that deal too.
Thank you. Tom, we're moving into the future.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you described perhaps some of the reaction to the withdrawal agreement as a false dawn. I think it would also be fair to say that this is not the end, the beginning of the end, and given the arithmetic of the House of Commons, probably not even the end of the beginning. But if you will indulge me for a moment in the hypothetical that the withdrawal agreement does find a majority in the House of Commons and we move into the post-29th of March world, the negotiations that the United Kingdom will have to undertake with the European Union will be the most difficult negotiations the UK has had to conduct in the post-war era. The UK, a state which has not had an independent trade policy in almost half a century, will be going up against a trading superpower. There's clearly a great asymmetry of power in this scenario. However, this is further compounded by the arrangements that are made, provisions are made for within the withdrawal agreement. With reference to the withdrawal agreement and the lack of any unilateral options for the UK, can you perhaps characterise the context that the UK will have to conduct these negotiations in, and what you think some of the implications would be with regards to the concessions that the European Union will be able to extract on numerous areas, for example, fishing?
Well, I had a fascinating conversation with a Swiss negotiator some time ago who said to me, the UK should remember that they're, if they're going to negotiate with the EU, they're negotiating with the best in the world. And what we've actually seen is some, I think, fairness and generosity from the EU, but a recognition that if the UK sets its red lines, then that's in the end what's going to dictate what comes out. If the UK had gone in a better frame of mind and gone in better prepared and better briefed, and with a better set of red lines, for example, looking at single market and customs union membership, it could have come out with those things. What will be necessary in these negotiations is absolute clarity of what the UK wants and how it can get it. One of the remarkable things of the last 2 and a bit years is that what the UK wanted was only written down eventually in the Chequers Agreement. We'd had actually 2 years from the referendum to the Chequers Agreement without anything written down. Now, why was that? Because we now know, having seen what happened after the Chequers Agreement, when it was written down, people fell out over it and couldn't agree and resigned because of what's in it. And that's happened again with a written agreement. Now, last week, more people resigned. So the more specific the UK has become, the less able it has been able to keep its own people on board, and the more it actually has been the victim of others. I think we'll see that during these very complicated negotiations, regrettably. I mean, I have little confidence that they will produce the results that are much vaunted. But remember, this takes a long time, and people's memories are often short. And we see what we're seeing at the present moment, that people say, a plague on all your houses. We've had enough of all this. We just want it to stop. Our obligation, I would suggest, is to persist, to tell people the truth of it as we see it, and to try and ameliorate the difficulties and disasters if we can. And that's what we'll go on trying to do. And this also, things keep changing minute by minute. I mean, I've just been told that this morning on radio, Amber Rudd says, it is my view Parliament will stop no deal. Now, she said that on Radio 4 this morning. She has, in a sense, torpedoed the Prime Minister's argument it's either her deal or no deal. So that gives an opportunity to say, let's get this as right as we can, given the chaos, and that would allow us to reject that deal and to do something better. If we were to choose the single market and customs union option, of course, then the type of negotiations you're talking about wouldn't be necessary.
You spoke about the generosity and charity of the European Union in these negotiations. However, when it comes to deciding upon a free trade arrangement with the United Kingdom, ultimately it will be a transactional consideration. Now, as provisions within the withdrawal agreement effectively state that the UK is locked in a customs union or a shared customs area with the European Union until such times as Brussels determines otherwise, does this not make it impossible, therefore, without an agreement with Europe, for the UK to cut any independent trade deals with third countries?
Well, I mean, they may cut them, but they'll be at a great disadvantage in so doing, and we know that. I mean, there's no pot of gold. I've said this, I think, every time I've been in this committee. There is no pot of gold in these new trade negotiations. It simply does not exist. And it's a cruel deception to people to say it does exist. Any deals that will be struck will be disadvantageous and minor. I noticed that last weekend, while all the fuss was going on in London, that David Davis and the former Agriculture Secretary, whose name escapes me, Owen Patterson, indeed, were in Oklahoma, or discussing trade matters with the Trade Commission from Oklahoma. You know, and apparently there are huge trading opportunities in Oklahoma. What they failed to notice, then in actual fact, that there are 2 European countries higher up in the amount of trade they do with Oklahoma than ourselves, both Germany and the Netherlands. So there's no barriers, if you wish to trade to Oklahoma, to do so now. The fact that it's not being done is probably a reflection of how poor the UK has been in setting up these agreements. But Oklahoma is 0.3% of the trade potential of the United States. So this is all nonsensical. Can I make a point about, I think, the 3 big issues in here? One is the integrity of the single market will be very important to the EU, and that will dominate the next process. It will be absolutely determined not to weaken that. Secondly, the UK will be as a third country. It will be treated like a third country. So it won't have any heft or weight in negotiations which it has as a member of the EU. And thirdly, we are not the centre of the universe. British exceptionalism has been a real problem within these negotiations. And the reality of the situation is there are bigger fish to fry in the EU at the present moment. And therefore this will fall rapidly down the agenda of an EU which has major issues of its own to address.
If I could very finally, Cabinet Secretary, ask about with regard to timescales. Do you think the timescales set out within the withdrawal agreement are realistic, given that an average EU trade deal takes about 4 years plus a lengthy implementation period?
They're utterly impossible. The European elections take place in June, so you can't expect anything much to happen between March and June, nothing at all. Then a new commission comes in. I think the expectations is it will be hard to form that commission, given the likely outcome of the elections, which will not be clear-cut. So you could, October is normally about the earliest to expect a commission to be in place. It could be the end of the year. What does that leave? 12 months.
Well,
And I mean, you can't do this in 12 months. So when Barnier says, we'll give you till the end of 2022, and Tory Brexiteers throw their hands up in horror and shout about vassal states, they'll be lucky that 2022 is the conclusion, given the complexity of it.
You stated October. That would give 9 months before the decision has to be made. But it would give 9 months before having to make a decision on extending a transition period. So do you think it's inevitable the transition period would have to be extended?
It's impossible to do it in the time required. There was apparently the end of the transition period. The date was to be written to the withdrawal implementation bill. I'd be highly surprised if that happens now.
So,
Willie, do you still want to ask that question?
If I could, Bruce, if there's time, thanks very much. Cabinet Secretary, I just wanted to ask a wee question about the digital single market. The Prime Minister's on record saying we're coming out of that as well. As you probably know, the digital single market's worth about €400 billion per year and supports hundreds of thousands of jobs right across the European Union. And in half an hour or so we've been here, I've searched the document. You don't have to read it cover to cover, but there's only 4 mentions of the word digital in it, and they're about digitally signing application forms for residency. So there's not a word in the entire document about this massive digital economy in Europe. What's the Scottish Government's view about this, and how can we possibly take this forward to ensure that Scotland's interests are maintained in this economy?
We've addressed this in previous publications. It's not just a question, when you leave this whole process of leaving the EU, it's not just walking away from things that are valuable. It is also foregoing opportunities that would continue to be valuable. And the digital single market is a classic example of foregoing opportunities. You know, Edinburgh's a very good example. I declare an interest. You know, my son is involved in the tech sector in Edinburgh. Edinburgh's got a flourishing tech sector. You know, the opportunities for Edinburgh and for Scotland in the digital single market are enormous, but they are immensely diminished because we will not be in it as a member. We'll be in it as a third country, and third countries by definition do not get the privileges of membership. So this is really a crying shame for the opportunity that exists. In Edinburgh, throughout the UK, these are opportunities that will not be taken. And these are the opportunities of, you know, the next decade of the 21st century. These are the things which we would need to do. Now, we will no doubt be able to do some of them, but one hand will be tied behind our back. And why should we do that? Why should we? We didn't vote to do that. We don't want to do that. That's the wrong thing for us, but it's being imposed upon us. And that is utterly wrong.
Okay, I don't see any other member wishing to ask any more questions. So I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his evidence this morning. The committee previously agreed to take the next item in private, so I now close this public part of the meeting.